a retired nurse, a park ranger, a nature photographer, an Alaskan hunter, and an airman. You may wonder, what could these people have in common? Well, they all suffered terribly at the hands, or better said, claws and jaws of enraged bears. Welcome to Fiercest Bear Attack Marathon, a retrospective of the most jarring and gruesome stories covered on the channel. We invite you to sit back, relax, and prepare to be frightened. Mother Nature is a harsh teacher. She won't let you make the same mistake twice. Today we tell the tragic story of the death of Davis Lokan, a 65-year-old retired nurse from California who came face to face with the savage Montana grizzly bear and did not live to tell the tale. It all began when Davis decided to take part in a Tour Divide bicycle race, a 2,745-mile ultra-endurance cycling event which runs from Banff to New Mexico. Davis embarked on the much-anticipated event with her sister and a friend. Like anyone enjoying her retirement, Davis was excited by the upcoming trip and made all the necessary arrangements. She packed enough food and clothes for several days. She even packed bear spray. But it wasn't enough. Grizzlies are some of the biggest predators in the world. The adult males can weigh up to 360 kilograms and be as tall as 3 meters when standing. They have razor-sharp claws, which grow up to 10 centimeters long, and the force of their bite is estimated to be between 975 and 1,160 pounds. That's enough to crack a bowling ball. However, while they are one of the most powerful members of the animal kingdom, it is relatively rare for them to attack. In the U.S., it's estimated that around 11 people die every year from grizzlies, which is statistically very low, considering there are approximately 58,000 grizzly bears in North America. To put this into context, you are more likely to be killed by a domestic dog, bees, or a lightning strike. However, when bears do become aggressive, it's usually because they feel threatened or are protecting cubs. In this case, it was because of food. Davis Lokan was an experienced traveler. She only made one important mistake, but she paid the ultimate price. It all happened in the tiny town of Ovando, along the banks of the Blackfoot River, on 6 July 2021. Davis, her sister, and the friend had arrived the day before, and Davis announced that she wanted to camp outdoors that night as it was warm and she had found the perfect camping spot behind a museum. Her sister and the friend didn't like the idea. They said there were reports of a wild bear roaming nearby. The town borders a sprawling expanse of forest that is home to an estimated 1,000 grizzlies. However, there was a Texan couple taking part in the cycle race named Kim and Joe Cole. They had also decided to camp outdoors, and Davis said she wanted to camp under the stars with them. Her sister and her friend weren't happy, but they left Davis and went to a hotel. This is where things began to go bad for Davis. It was just after 3 a.m. that she heard a snuffling sound from outside. She wasn't sure what it was, but it sounded close and big. The bear outside was over 190 kilograms, approximately 417 pounds. After a few minutes, she heard a terrifying huffing through the tent, right next to her head. Upon hearing this, Davis immediately realized what it must be. Fear coursed through her, but she was used to tense moments. Being a nurse means staying calm in chaotic situations. She instantly reacted by shouting, "Bear! Bear!" at the top of her lungs, and jumping up and down in her tent. Kim and Joe Cole also woke up and made as much noise as possible. This was the right thing to do. Bears will almost always avoid humans if they can. In this case, the bear leapt up and ran away into the dark. Shocked and terrified, Davis gathered herself. The Coles comforted her and asked if she wanted to move to a hotel with her sister. Joe Cole said he wasn't comfortable leaving her alone in a tent with a bear on the loose. However, Davis was adamant she wanted to be outside. She said she knew why the bear had approached. There was a pack containing lentils in her tent. Had it not been for that, she said, the bear would never have come close. In an attempt to remedy her mistake, she immediately took every crumb of food out of her tent and stored it in a nearby building. However, she didn't account for the bear's incredible sense of smell, and she left a small bag of toiletries in her tent, a bag which had contained cranberries the day before. That tiny residue of food was all it took to attract the bear, and that mistake was the last one Davis would ever make. About an hour later, Joe and Kim Cole awoke to a horrible sound. There was a terrible roaring coming from the other side of the camp, and fear filled them when they realized what was happening. The bear had returned. Running out of the tent, Joe shouted, "Bear, bear," at the top of his voice, while his wife Kim started blowing an emergency whistle. The bear was only meters away, pounding up and down on Davis's tent. It stopped for a moment when Joe emerged and looked him directly in the eye, showing no fear at all. Joe thought that this was the end for him as well, but luckily he had bear spray and he quickly shot the entire can in the bear's direction. The bear turned and ran back into the woods, but it was too late. As Joe and Kim approached the tent, they saw a terrible sight that would stay with them forever. Davis had been crushed and dragged half out of the sleeping bag by the bear. There were horrible wounds to her neck and spine. She had died instantly, and there were no signs that the bear had begun to consume her body. This was at least a small mercy. The National Park Service later did a full report, describing this as a predatory attack and saying the bear must have been food conditioned, meaning that it had learned that humans regularly carry food and subsequently had lost all fear of people. A very dangerous thing indeed. They also said it wasn't only the food residue in the tent that had attracted the bear, but the surrounding park as well, due to the fact that there had recently been 4th of July celebrations and the entire area was littered with leftovers. Soon after this, the bear was seen breaking into a nearby chicken coop. Authorities shot the bear on the 9th of July after several days of tracking him to be sure that it was the right animal. DNA analysis from the bear's paws confirmed that it was responsible for Davis Lokan's death. While nothing can make up for her tragic loss, at least Davis's family can be comforted by the knowledge that it won't take any more lives. Despite this horrific attack, bear experts maintain that most bears are peaceful animals and non-threatening to humans. The mistake that Davis made was to return to her tent after the first encounter. This probably emboldened the bear, which already lacked sufficient fear of people. Combined with the food residue in the park and her toiletries bag, this likely drove the bear into a predatory state. It's possible that a simple movement made by Davis, such as turning over in her sleeping bag, caused the bear to pounce as if it had encountered a prey animal, which ended in the sad loss of life, both for Davis and for the bear itself. How to be grizzly bear safe. Don't go alone. Groups are usually louder and more boisterous than solitary hikers, so the bear is most likely to steer clear of you. Stay on the path. Bears will usually avoid areas where they think humans will be, so it's best to keep to the established routes. Make yourself heard by talking gently and loudly so the bear knows you are a human and not prey. Remain still, stand your ground, but peacefully wave your arms. This will help the bear see you as a human. Try to remain calm by remembering that most bears have no interest in you. They usually just want to be left in peace. On no account scream or make high-pitched yells, and never try to imitate bear sounds. This will only irritate it. Make yourselves look as big as possible by moving to higher ground or waving your arms. Putting your pack on can also help. Move away slowly while trying to be as non-threatening as possible. Don't climb a tree. Bears are very good climbers. Always carry bear spray. Never get between a mother and her cub. Never leave food out or containers which have food residue. Bears have incredibly powerful noses, and they will smell it from miles away. If a bear is acting aggressive, leave the area immediately and safely. It's possible the bear has been food conditioned or habituated to humans. This can be deadly. In this story, Park Ranger Jordan Carbery has to think of an escape plan while the grizzly is eating his scalp for breakfast. We sometimes think we're untouchable. We have the comfort of our houses, of our properties, places we know like the back of our hand. But sometimes, safety is a beautiful illusion, one we come to accept too quickly. When we share our backyards with the wilderness, accidents are likely to happen. And sometimes there's no other choice than to fight for what we have, to fight to survive. This story takes us to Bella Coola, a community in British Columbia, Canada. The entire valley where the community is situated had, as of 2021, a population of only 2,163 people. It's easy to see why Bella Coola is a luxuriant paradise. The valley is crossed by a generous river. The trees are evergreen. The valley has a long, rich history, with the First Nations Nuxalk people dating back 10,000 years. But more astonishing even is that Bella Coola is located in the heart of the Great Bear Rainforest. Wild animals abound, and they are protected by authorities. It was the evening of July 2, 2018, when Jordan Carbery, a 50-year-old park ranger from Bella Coola, was returning home. He had been on a week-long vacation, celebrating his birthday with friends. As he drove up his driveway, the man saw two grizzly bears in a cherry tree nearby his house. The bears seemed pretty big, so Jordan assumed they were adults. It made sense for the animals to be in the tree. Its branches were ripe with delicious fruit, and bears are notorious cherry eaters. Even more, they carry the seeds in their guts, which, through physiological processes, then helps disperse them. Jordan didn't want the bears too close to his home, though, so he continued up his driveway in order to make them go away. Eventually, the two bears did go, and Jordan thought nothing of it. After all, he was a park ranger, and he had had hundreds and hundreds of close black bear encounters during his career. The man went to bed, content to be back home after a beautiful vacation. The next morning, Jordan woke up at about 5 o'clock in the morning. He put on his slippers and went on with his usual morning routine. He was on the second floor of his house, looking out of his wide French window, when something really caught his eye. There was something moving behind the trees. Carbery kept on looking. The cherry tree's leaves were rustling atypically. Amused, Jordan assumed the two bears from the previous night were back for some more of the delicious red fruits. For Jordan, this was an amazing opportunity to take some one-of-a-kind pictures of the local wildlife. Grizzlies in a cherry tree. That was bound to be an impressive sight, one he wanted to share with his friends. Still in his slippers, Jordan took his camera and went down the stairs and out of the house, determined to take some unique photos. He was a relentless amateur photographer, and he took his camera everywhere. The previous night, he'd been sure those were two full-grown bears, and he was sure still. As long as he didn't take them by surprise or went too close, everything was supposed to go smoothly. He'd take his photos and be back for coffee in no time. He got out his front door and took around 20 paces around a big clump of trees. He wanted to take a really clear, really expressive picture, so Jordan made sure he'd have a straight view. He was approximately 36 feet away from his house, not a spectacular distance by any means. As he approached, the two bears came clearly into view. They were up in the tree, looking rather funny, as they had their fill of sweet cherries. All of a sudden, a branch gave way under one of the bear's weight and simply snapped. The bear fell to the ground below. Jordan caught something in his left eye and turned his head to see better. What he saw made his blood run cold. He had been gravely mistaken. The two grizzlies, having their fill of cherries, were not adults, but almost grown cubs, and to his left stood the mama bear. The sow was approximately 82 feet away from him. It slowly turned toward the man, and from the look on her wild face, Jordan assumed it blamed him for its cubs falling off the tree. The grizzly locked and leapt, starting to run toward Jordan Carbery. He couldn't believe his eyes. The bear was fast, so much faster than he imagined. Jordan could hear his heart beating. His mouth turned dry. He started running. Him starting to run wasn't a conscious decision. It was pure instinct. He could see his front door clearer now. He was so close to safety, he could almost feel it. By the time the grizzly hit him from the back, Jordan was about 9 feet away from the door. The massive paw to the back sent him flying in the air. The man landed on the ground with a loud and painful thud. The bear hurried toward him. The terror was so incredible. Jordan almost didn't register when the sow opened her jaws and picked him up by his skull. The force of her bite was so massive, a part of Jordan's scalp ripped and fell to the ground, causing the bear to let go of his head. But his suffering was far from over. The furious grizzly then started biting the man all over his body. It tore off his ear and slashed at his chest. It bit his legs and chewed at his abdomen. Its rage was one of a kind, the rage of a mother who believed its cubs were in danger. For a moment, Jordan thought this was the last time he was going to see the light of day. But as the bear repeatedly bit his abdomen, the man made a decision. He wanted to fight for his life. Jordan started hitting the sow's head. The bear was even angrier now, and it pulled him over again. As he lied on his side, muscle memory kicked in. Jordan recently had some ranger training in defensive tactics with modified Krav Maga moves. It seemed like his body remembered the training. The man waited for the bear to get closer and then started hitting it with his heel, straight in its eye. Pure adrenaline was rushing through his body. The bear backed off in confusion, giving Jordan the time to pull himself up. Then the grizzly charged again. Jordan tried to hammer fist its snout, but the bear seemed to understand the danger and dodged the attacks. The man managed to get into his house. His fear was still palpable. His door was thin. The bear could have easily charged and followed him into the house. For some reason, it didn't. But Carbery wasn't out of the woods just yet. He lived in an area with little to no cell coverage. He had no landline, and he was all alone. The adrenaline was still there, but he knew his body had suffered gruesome wounds. He grabbed for his keys, but they weren't in their usual spot on the kitchen table. His limbs were trembling, but he somehow managed to go upstairs and get his keys from his bedside table. He stumbled outside the house and to his car. As he pulled the handle, he saw the grizzly bear coming at him for the 4th time. He got in the car and stepped on the gas. "Don't pass out. Don't pass out," Jordan kept repeating to himself. He was half sure his insides were spilling out and he would die alone. But he also remembered he had a wife, a daughter, a mom, dad, and brother. He had people who cared for him, so he had to make it. Jordan Carbery made it to the hospital. He was airlifted to a Vancouver hospital where he underwent several surgeries for his extensive injuries. A part of his right ear was missing. He had a torn scalp, several puncture wounds, and an umbilical hernia caused by the bear's repeated clawing at his abdomen. But he was alive and under care. Carbery takes full responsibility for the accident. He knows he shouldn't have risked his life for some photos, and he's happy to have survived a grizzly bear encounter. He was even happier to hear that the bear had not been killed. After all, Jordan knew the sow was only protecting its cubs. Today we tell the spine-tingling but true story of Jim Cole, a man who escaped the jaws of death. Not just once, but twice. A professional photographer and author of 3 books on animal encounters, Jim Cole is a legend among animal experts and wildlife protectors. The story we're about to tell is a harrowing account of how Jim lost an eye and nearly bled to death in the wild, all for the sake of a photograph. It all happened in the spring of 2007 in one of the most beautiful places in the world, Yellowstone National Park, a place of natural wonders and majestic megafauna. Nestled in the western heart of the United States, bordering Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho, Yellowstone was the first location to ever be given national park status in 1872. This truly epic landscape spans nearly 3,500 square miles, or just under 9,000 square kilometers, and is home to some of the most beautiful canyons, rivers, and mountains in the world. Incredibly, more than half the world's geysers are located in Yellowstone. This is because the park also boasts the one and only Yellowstone caldera, the largest supervolcano on the continent of America. Due to its protected status, Yellowstone has been able to maintain a near-virgin ecosystem, one of the last places in the Northern Hemisphere to do so. Because of this, it was also named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978. Hundreds of species of birds and more than 60 species of mammals, many of them megafauna, roam free among the soaring geysers, petrified forests, and deep canyons of this protected countryside. But while Yellowstone may be one of the most beautiful places on the planet, it's also one of the most treacherous. This incredibly diverse terrain harbors everything from bison and elk to mountain goats and bighorn sheep, not to mention the Rocky Mountain wolves, coyotes, and Canadian lynx. But there is one animal which is more fearsome than all the rest. One beast who is bigger and more powerful than all the others. Equally suited to running, climbing, or swimming, one creature dominates every landscape it sets foot in: the grizzly bear. Weighing up to 360 kilograms or 790 pounds and measuring as tall as 2.7 meters, 9 feet when standing on two legs, grizzlies are one of the biggest land carnivores in the world. They are also one of the most dangerous. In the United States alone, these bears killed 24 people between the year 2000 and 2015. Some, but not all of those, were in Yellowstone. Another 44 people were reported injured in the Yellowstone area. However, it's important to note that almost all of these incidents were not the bears' fault. By their nature, bears are very peaceful animals, and it's extremely rare for them to predate a human. The truth is that usually the bears are only acting in self-defense. The frequency of these attacks comes instead from the fact that humans commonly take careless risks around bears, and sometimes those risks have devastating consequences, as we're about to find out. 25th of May, 2007. It was around 8 a.m., and since shortly before dawn, Jim Cole had been trekking along the footpaths of Yellowstone National Park, alone, carrying only his light backpack and his expensive camera equipment. He was looking for bears. Specifically, he was trying to get a shot of a mother bear called a sow with her cubs. However, Jim had some shooting techniques that not everyone appreciated. Other photographers called it controversial and highly dangerous. His technique involved getting close to animals, very close. This technique had already caused Jim a substantial amount of pain in the past. In September of 1993, while walking in Glacier National Park in the Rocky Mountains, Jim had crept into a bear's territory, getting very close to its den, so close that he practically stood on the bear, who was sleeping in the bushes. Not happy about being discovered, the bear mauled his head and wrist, and Jim came close to dying. But Jim recovered, and somehow his enthusiasm for bears only increased. Some might call Jim a fool who failed to learn his lesson. Others would say he was the definition of a brave man. On this particular afternoon, he wasn't feeling very brave. Instead, he was frustrated. He'd been searching all week without seeing a single bear. Sure, there'd been plenty of signs, broken branches and bear scat, but not one glimpse of an actual animal. So in desperation, he did something no Yellowstone visitor should ever do. He went off trail. Being a seasoned professional, he was confident he didn't need to worry about the general advice given by the park ranger. He thought the rules didn't apply to him. He was wrong. A few hours into his hike along the Hayden Valley area, he began to get excited. He saw signs in the snow, signs that showed quite clearly that a large bear was nearby, possibly a bear with cubs, which is exactly what Jim was looking for. A few hours went by and Jim enjoyed his magnificent surroundings as he always did, taking photo after photo of various birds, a few deer, and even a lone wolf far in the hazy distance. The air had that crisp feeling that only spring can bring. As he breathed in, he felt the trees sprouting leaves again, the flowers beginning to bloom from under the snow. All around him, animals were mating and babies were being born. The world was full of life. Soon, it would be full of bloody violence. After a while of following trails, Jim felt like he must be very close to the bear. He took out his camera and crept further through the trees. Suddenly, something moved in the bushes right in front of him. Excited, he crept closer. However, his excitement turned to concern when he realized what it was: a bear cub, all alone. No sign of the mother. Jim knew that there was no way a bear sow would leave the cub alone in the woods. She had to be somewhere nearby. He spun around and to his horror saw something moving to his side. It was her, the mama bear. With a sense of gut-wrenching fear, he realized he had somehow walked right between her and her cub. Luckily, neither of them had seen him yet. Jim gripped his camera in one hand and tried to move away as quickly as possible. He knew he was in mortal danger and his heart was beating fast, but he was so close to the bear, he couldn't resist the temptation to take one photograph. He raised the camera to his eye and clicked. That was all it took. In an instant, both bears looked up and roared. The cub bounded away from him in fear, but the mother leapt towards him with ferocious speed. Before Jim even had time to reach for his bear spray, the mama bear's claws ripped through the flesh of his face, cutting him from his jaw to his forehead, slicing through an eye, and tearing his cheek muscles to shreds. After that, everything was a blur. Somehow the bear let him go, maybe sensing that he was no longer a threat, and Jim stumbled away. Running for his life, in a state of near death, he had to hike for another 2 or 3 miles, desperately holding his bleeding face, before he was spotted by 2 visitors called John and Judy, who had stopped for a moment to admire the view. Safe to say, they saw more than they were expecting. Jim Cole underwent several hours of surgery to repair the terrible wound on his face, and he was left with a dramatic scar across his cheek and an eye patch. In the end, he was lucky to be alive. Despite all of this, Jim had no hard feelings toward the bear. He remained an enthusiastic advocate for the rights of bears until he passed away in July 2010 at age 60 from natural causes at his home in Montana. How to be grizzly bear safe. Don't go alone. Groups are usually louder and more boisterous than solitary hikers, so the bear is most likely to steer clear of you. Stay on the path. Bears will actively avoid areas where they think humans will be, so it's best to keep to the established routes. Make yourself heard by talking gently and loudly so the bear knows you are a human and not prey. Remain still, stand your ground, but peacefully wave your arms. This will help the bear see you as human. Try to remain calm by remembering that most bears have no interest in you. They usually just want to be left in peace. On no account scream or make high-pitched yells, and never try to imitate bear sounds. This will only irritate it. Make yourself look as big as possible by moving to higher ground or waving your arms. Putting your pack on can also help. Move away slowly while trying to be as non-threatening as possible. Don't climb a tree. Bears are very good climbers. Always carry bear spray. Never get between a mother and her cub. Kodiak Island sits on the severe but beautiful south coast of Alaska, USA. Crisscrossed with sparkling rivers and ice-cold bays, The island is famous for its salmon, which in the summer months bring fishermen from all over the world. But this place is famous for another reason. The northern half of the island is carpeted in a dense mountainous forest. And in the forest, bears. But not just any bear. The Kodiak bear is the biggest carnivore in the world. On average, slightly larger than the polar bear, Kodiak bears belong to the brown bear variety, which is common throughout Alaska and North America. But it's their distinctive diet that makes them so massive. Yep, you guessed it, salmon. These mighty behemoths are lucky enough to have their own high-protein superfood right on their doorstep. This allows them to get extra huge. They are basically the bodybuilders of the animal world. In peak season, the adult males can weigh as much as 635 kilograms or 1,400 pounds and stand up to 3 meters, 9.8 feet, when on 2 legs. That's roughly as heavy as a grand piano and as half as tall as a giraffe. Not something you'd want to get into fisticuffs with. But that's exactly what happened to veteran hunter Gene Moe on November 1st, 1999. Gene had been out hunting along the ridge of the Kodiak woods, just as he'd done for many years. He'd seen plenty of bears before and even had some frightening encounters. But nothing had prepared him for the epic battle he was about to have with the biggest man-eater on planet Earth. As he made his way through the forest, he noticed several deep gouges along the bark of a tree. Gene thought the rips looked like they'd been made by a chainsaw, not an animal. He knew this was a bear's way of marking its territory, and he resolved to get as far away as fast as possible. But it wasn't that simple. Gene had spent all day stalking a deer, and the trail took him round in wide circle, so that when he eventually caught up with his prey, he was right back in the beast's territory. Unfortunately, by that point, he was too caught up in the hunt to notice. This was his first big mistake. The sky was growing dark when he finally shot and killed the deer. At least, he thought. A hard day's hunt. He leaned his rifle against a log and started skinning the deer next to a stream, a little way off. This was his second big mistake. As Gene peacefully began to cut the hide away from the deer's succulent flesh, the scent of blood and gore wafted into the summer evening breeze. It wasn't long before that scent reached the sharp nostrils of a nearby Kodiak bear. That's the thing about bears. Some of the best hunters in the food chain, but they will just as happily steal someone else's lunch. Gene was about to go from hunter to hunted. One minute he was bent over, meticulously trimming the skin for the deer. The next, he heard a sound that would stay with him for the rest of his life. A bear's roar, so loud it shook the trees. The beast came out of the forest with the force of a steam train, knocking Gene hard to the ground and clawing at his throat with vicious, sharp talons. Gene was engulfed in the bear's massive bulk. Its fur filled his mouth and eyes, and he was completely disoriented. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. It was like the worst bear hug in the world. Luckily, he still had his knife in his hand, and he jabbed again and again in the creature's thick hide, but to no avail. The bear got hold of his arm in its jaws and crunched down. The pain was all-encompassing, but somehow he had the presence of mind to keep stabbing and kicking the animal. Gene was wearing big, heavy mountain boots, and they probably saved his life because miraculously he was able to kick the half-ton creature off of him. He got up fast and looked around. The sensation of being able to see, to breathe, overwhelmed him more than the pain. For a moment, he thought he'd die in that bear hug. But his euphoria didn't last long. He saw, with a sinking heart, his gun still leaning against the log where he'd left it, too far away. He'd never reach it before the bear was on top of him again. If the bear got him on the ground again, he wouldn't be getting up. So he turned away from his gun and stabbed instead into the creature's neck, trying to slit its throat. Adrenaline pulsed through his body. Every nerve screamed that it wanted to live. But the muscles of the bear's neck were too thick, like tree roots, and he only managed to make a deep gash across its front. At this, the bear roared, spilling blood onto the moss, and lunged at Gene with all its might. Again, Gene was lucky. Like a prize bullfighter, he stepped aside at the very last minute, and the bear missed him by centimeters. Seeing his moment, he brought the blade sharp down as hard as he could on the beast's back, exactly where he knew the vertebrae was. The knife went in. Gene's heartbeat stopped for a minute. The bear roared. Obviously badly wounded, the beast moved away, circling around. Gene didn't dare move. He wiped the blood from his eyes with his good arm. His other arm was crushed and useless. He could feel the beginnings of severe agony from a dozen lashes across his body. He knew that if the bear came in for another attack, he would almost certainly die. He looked into the bear's eyes and decided that only one thing would save him now, and that thing was God. "Lord," Gene said out loud, "please help me, Lord. I need help." Just at that moment, the bear came in again. It seemed to move slowly this time, and blood spilled out of its fur as it jumped forward. Gene acted without thinking. Dropping his knife, he swung his good arm back into a wide arc and brought it down with all the strength he had left in his body. His fist hit the bear's nose so hard it broke his hand in several places. But the bear went down. It bounced once, then its enormous head came to rest on a patch of moss. Gene thought, "Is it dead?" He hobbled over and grabbed his gun. He meant to shoot the beast, but his hands were both bloody and numb. They hurt so much he couldn't pull the trigger. Fortunately, the animal was already dead. But Gene's incredible story doesn't end there. He knew he was losing a lot of blood and needed to get off the island and to a hospital as quickly as possible. Again, he prayed, asking for the strength to get down to the beach where his friend had a boat. And again, his prayers were answered. The trip was anything but easy. Coming down off that mountain was the hardest thing he'd ever done. A total of 3 times, Gene lay down in the moss to die. But every time he prayed to God and got up again. Eventually, he reached the shore. His friend helped him to a nearby cabin, from where they were able to call a helicopter. It took Gene a month of rehab, 2 skin grafts, and 500 stitches before he made a full recovery. But in the end, he came out better than the bear, which was later recovered and skinned. Till this day, Gene Moe has that bear skin hanging on his wall. October 2008. Matthew Sutton, a 31-year-old father of 5, had been a hunter as long as he could remember. As well as his family life and service in the Air Force, Matthew also loved to explore Alaska. He usually visited for hunting trips each year, but this year was different. He and his friend Bill Bush loaded a bush plane on Kodiak Island and flew to a remote location approximately 30 miles away. They planned to hunt Sitka deer and Kodiak bears. They rented a hunting cabin in Vikota Bay. It was a simple wooden cabin consisting of a single room which they had planned to use for a couple of weeks. Kodiak Island is an outdoor enthusiast paradise. Wide and varied habitats consisting of streams, lakes, wetlands, grasslands, spruce forests, and alpine meadows are home to an abundance of wildlife. Foxes, otters, beavers, and deer, as well as elk, pine marten, and more than 250 visiting bird species are found there. Of course, being so close to the Pacific Ocean, the rivers and streams are also full of migratory Pacific salmon, which make the journey across hundreds of miles from the ocean back to the rivers to spawn. This, in turn, attracts bears. The Kodiak bear, a subspecies of the brown grizzly bear, is the largest in the world, weighing in at 1,200 pounds and standing up to 10 feet tall on its hind legs. They are an impressive sight. There are 2 bear hunting seasons each year. The spring season is open from April through mid-May, and the fall season is from the end of October to the end of November. Matthew and Bill took a Zodiac inflatable boat across the water from their cabin to hunt Sitka deer in the mountains. The water was calm and still. The scenery was breathtaking. It wasn't long before they found their deer. In the forest, dappled with sunlit light, the deer was walking slowly through the colorful fall leaves, making barely a sound. Matthew held his breath, steadying his rifle, and took a clean shot. The doe was killed instantly and fell to the ground. He calmly walked over to the kill, field dressed it, and then dragged it down the mountain towards the water and their moored-up boat. From there, the 2 men would take the deer back to their lodge. On his way down the hill, through the trees and less than 100 yards from the shoreline, Matthew heard a noise. He glanced to his side. A young Kodiak bear came bursting through the undergrowth and jumped at Matthew. Initially, Matthew thought it was a mock charge and stood tall, but the bear came at him again. He turned his back on it and it hit him to the ground. The air was knocked from Matthew's lungs. Winded and shocked at the sudden attack, he shook his head, trying to make sense of the situation. Then Matthew felt an intense pressure on the back of his neck as the bear picked him up in its mouth, tossing him around like a rag doll. Flesh was ripped from Matthew's neck, the top of his spinal column showing through the gaping wound. Matthew summoned all of his Air Force training to keep calm and relaxed as his body was thrown around by this large cub. Finally, the bear threw him to the ground. Matthew played dead, face down in the dirt and amongst the autumnal leaves, but the bear wasn't finished with him yet. It placed a single paw on Matthew's back and slashed him with its other. Then, to Matthew's horror, another cub and its mother appeared. The mother was easily 8 feet long and began devouring the deer carcass. Matthew lay there, motionless on the ground. Should he stay lying there pretending to be another carcass? Should he run and hide? He decided he should try and scare the bears off. He jumped up and, waving his hands above his head, he began yelling at the bears. But they were not afraid. They merely looked up at him midway through their meal, jowls dripping. One cub ran over to Matthew, knocking him onto his back. It placed a heavy paw on Matthew's chest. An adult Kodiak bear's paw can measure up to 19 inches long. The pressure built on Matthew's chest as the full weight of the animal began to bear down on him. In a desperate attempt to fight it off, Matthew began punching it in its face, clawing it on the muzzle, and trying to gouge its eyes. He knew this was the end, and yet he felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He prayed for his wife and children and closed his eyes, waiting for death to envelop him. He was at peace. But to his surprise, as the bear's huge jaws clamped down on him once more, it suddenly leapt backwards and ran back to the others. Its tooth seemed to have connected with Matthew's wedding ring, a strange sensation the bear was not familiar with. Just then, Bill appeared from deep in the woods. He was shouting Matthew's name. As his calls became louder, the bears fled. Astonishingly, Matthew stood up and stumbled down to the shoreline, falling at Bill's feet. Horrified at his friend's injuries, Bill helped Matthew into their boat, lying him on the cold, hard aluminum floor. Hurriedly, he started the engine and zoomed back across the water to their cabin. To Matthew, each wavelet hitting the hull felt like a heavy thud across his body. His wounds were gaping. Bone and tendons could be seen through the flow of blood. Matthew looked up at the sky. He felt the cold breeze on his face. The adrenaline was beginning to wear off now, and his injuries became excruciating. After what seemed like an eternity, they made it to the shore. Bill hauled Matthew out of the boat and carried him back to their hut. Once inside, Bill lay Matthew down and began tending to his wounds. Their small first aid pack provided little medical equipment, but they would have to make do. A single pot of aspirin was all the pain relief they had. There was no mobile phone reception in the area, and with no satellite phone, Bill tried desperately to make Mayday calls on the VHF radio, but the signal was too weak. They weren't due to be collected by the plane for another 3 days, and Bill didn't think his friend would last that long. At each passing hour, Matthew grew weaker. He sipped on the water in his camel pack, feeling his body warm up as infection began to engulf him. For 2.5 days, Matthew clung on to life. In and out of consciousness, he desperately needed medical attention. On the 3rd day, pilot Steve Larson was flying overhead. Hearing the distant rumble of an aircraft, Bill leapt out of the cabin with his radio. He spotted the plane in the distance and made the urgent Mayday call, and, to his relief, the pilot responded. A Coast Guard helicopter was sent to the men's position, and Matthew was airlifted to a nearby hospital. His injuries were so severe that he was then transferred to Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage. Matthew had multiple operations to fix his broken body. He was given antibiotics to stave off the massive infection consuming him and received more than 140 staples to close up his wounds. After months of rehab, Matthew made a full recovery. He has returned to active duty in the Air Force and still, to this day, enjoys the wilds of Alaska. How to stay bear safe. Number 1. Be alert and make noise to avoid surprising a bear. Number 2. Hike in groups. Number 3. Carry bear spray and have it on hand. Bear spray is much more effective than a bullet. Number 4. Keep your distance if you see a bear. Number 5. If hunting or camping, store any food in bear lockers or high up in trees at a significant distance from your camp. Number 6. For a black bear, stand tall, gather together if in a group, and make loud noise. Number 7. For a grizzly bear, remain calm and back away very slowly.